Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the good morning and good evening. Welcome to the lovely class we have this evening with Rabbi Mendel Gurkov joining us virtually to discuss the history of the Bibles and other historical events. Thank you for joining us. And without further ado, Rabbi Gurkov.
Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, let me just get these settings here. All right. Okay, so I don't know if any of you read the article that I published in the Yeshiva magazine, but in short, that is a very thorough synopsis of the history of the blood libel and its effect on. Yeah. So the article is very, so if you read it, I'm going to be going through it, give a little background, any questions or anything in the like, be happy to answer. Okay, let's start. So the blood libel, okay. The blood libel is a claim that it seems ludicrous. It seems like it's something that's so unbelievable. How in the world did anybody at any point in history actually believe that we took blood, killed specifically young Christian children, drained their blood, and then put it in our matzahs to eat? Jews have been accused of a lot of things, but it's one of these claims that seems so crazy that we're pretty sure that it happened a long time ago, that it wasn't something that really, was around a lot. It might have come up once or twice, and it probably became very famous because of the golem and that story. But the truth is that the blood libel is one of the most persistent claims of anti-Semitic people ever, and it continues to pain us, and it continues to follow us around. And it evolved. It wasn't just a simple claim of us killing for matzah. In fact, it evolved from the number one anti-Semitic claim that there is, an allegation that we have today, and that is that we killed Yashke. The Jews killed the Christians' savior. We had a hand in it that we reported to the Romans. And since we reported to the Romans and we gave them up, so we are the problem. And we'll see how from that claim, the blood and how it came now and how it evolved into what it is now. So to start off, I mean, the article is laid out a little differently, but we'll start off like this. Medieval Europe, where the origins of the blood libel laid, we have to understand the historical context of medieval Europe. You see, Rome, the great empire of Rome, which lasted hundreds of years, was a high point of civilization. After the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire, and the great philosophers of Greek and this and that, it became Roman civilization, which took all the best parts of the Greek civilization, all the bad parts, and all the great advances of the civilizations before then, and they went further with them, and they created water ducts. They created a much more safe and a much more advanced society. They had literature, they had poetry, they had drama, and the world continued on a progression of further and further. Now the question is, we've seen from the past 100 years or so, 120, 130 years, and civilization has advanced dramatically, right? We came from a time of where we didn't have a car to plane, and in 100 years we took a leap. So, but if you look throughout history, you see that there's sort of a missing gap. There's a couple hundred years, if not more, where we sort of didn't really come up with anything. The society didn't really advance. In fact, we sort of went backwards. And that was medieval, and it was called the Dark Ages for a reason. because what happened is that people, after the fall of the Roman Empire, sort of went back to a very primitive way of thinking. And the rise of the church at that time to becoming not only a religious authority upon European civilization, but first and foremost also a part of the actual military, a part of the kingdom, people that ruled were members of the church, was because people began less and less to think lucid and logically and according to what logic would tell them, but rather think in terms of faith. In other words, when you stop thinking with your head and you only use faith, what ends up happening is that society stops progressing because you need to use your head in order to advance. And that's a simple way of putting it. And so the church became the de facto power, and the church Christianity relied first and foremost on, simply put, on believing what they said, and that's how they maintain control. A huge event in the Christianity's history, and thereby the history of civilization, was the advent of Islam. So when Islam became a world player, at that point, nobody was really challenging the church. You see, the church has split into two. There was the Roman Catholic Church in Byzantine, which is now Turkey. And then the other one, which was based in Rome, where we know who the Pope is and all that. But nobody really challenged them. As soon as Islam came into play, and with the rise of Islam, the church began to feel threatened. And therefore, they decided to maintain a vice-like grip on the territories that they did own. Which was pretty much all of the Eastern Europe and around Western Europe is where the fights with the various different tribes of the various Shiites, the Sunnis of the Muslims. And they advanced to Spain, the Muslims did, to France in certain cases. The Byzantine Empire fell eventually to that part of the church collapsed, and it fell to the Muslims. By the time we reach the late 11th century, okay, so in 1096, the Pope called for a crusade. Now, crusade is by nature a holy war in which everybody is asked to come together and to band together under a banner for God and to redeem territories lost by the church and lost by, and those territories would be in obviously Jerusalem, because that was the holiest place, and that was where the origin and the middle of the Holy Land, the origin of their savior of Yashka. So that's what they did. Everybody got together and decided they were going. In Jewish history, the crusade is very famous because the first crusade was known as Gezeres Tatno. The year was Tav Nun Vav, so Gezeres Tatno. It's very famous because what ended up happening is that before the actual crusade came into place, which was by a pope named Urban II, a bunch of basically peasants got together, and it was time for a mob. It was time for looting and time for them to take advantage, and they did. And they went to the great Jewish communities of the Rhineland. And at those times, cities or towns were very much disconnected from another, and to be able to pass messages from one to another was extremely hard. And so this vicious mob fell upon the three biggest, Speyer, Metz, and the Worms. They fell upon this great Jewish communities, which Rashi passed away a few years before that, and who had in that community was Rabbeinu Tam, which, if you learn in Gemara, is Rashi's grandson, is very famous and a very famous scholar. And they pillaged and destroyed these communities, great communities. And it was one of the worst tragedies. It was the worst tragedy that had befallen the Jewish people in terms of numbers since Yavne had been destroyed by the Romans. Since Beitar had been destroyed by the Romans all those years before. So we're talking about a catastrophe. All this background setting is where the blood libel came into play. So the Catholics continue, they fight off the Muslims, and they regain the Holy Land. They establish like Eastern states, and that's why if you go to Israel today, let's say you go to Akko, There's still a Crusader fortress there. All the Christian leanings of the land are from that era, the era of the Crusaders. And the Crusaders and the church and the Muslims would basically fight over the Holy Land for the next couple hundred years, back and forth, until basically the Muslims eventually prevailed and they left the Middle East. The Christians did, not to return. But once during that time, they won it over, and they established a state there, and then they returned to their houses. Returned having killed Jews, and returned having become rich, and having seen the benefits of a crusade. The benefits of a crusade, except obviously the religious and the zealot part of the people that were involved, were simply put because they wanted to redeem the Holy Land. However, the other part involved, and it was good business. There was a lot of money to be made in the crusade. There was a lot of money to take from people. There was a lot of territory to win, even slaves to be had. And so people wanted to join a crusade. Now, a lot of people in the first crusade didn't join. A lot of kings. At that point, there wasn't really one king over every country in Europe. It was much of a little fiefdoms. The reason why they didn't join is because they didn't know. It had never been done before. People hadn't just stood up and made a people's army. But suddenly, after the first crusade, there came a point in time where everybody suddenly realized that this is something that could actually work and people could benefit from it. So it became people that were pragmatic and realized this, decided they're going to get involved. And there was a second crusade, there was a third crusade. None of them had the success of the first crusade, but over time, every crusade was not a good thing for Jewish communities, and Jewish communities suffered worldwide. The reason is because Christianity had this interesting relationship with the Jews. Their first relationship with the Jews was that Christianity comes from Judaism. And in the beginning, it was basically just a different take on Yiddishkeit. And it wasn't really working, because if you know us Jews, we're very stubborn. So, either some people didn't, weren't from, okay, whatever, they don't listen, they do Averis. But come and tell us a new version of Judaism, people didn't accept it. They in other words, they were like, no, he's not, Yashka is not a Mashiach. It's not happening. So eventually what ended up happening was a man named Paul, a couple generations later, he decided and he made a tactical decision that the best way to spread Christianity were to be to change it and away and different, make it different than Judaism, and try to get Gentiles, try to get people that are pagan worships, people that worship idols and the like, or Greek mythology and stuff like that, try to get them to convert. And he was very successful at that. So he decided to make a big element of Christianity, to attack the Jew, to show the differences between Judaism and Christianity, and B, to make sure the Jews paid for the fact that they didn't accept Christianity. And that's our relationship with them. So all these theories about Judaism and our attacks in the beginning, and how all these claims made, are simply put because there had to be a clear distinction made between the two. Otherwise, no other non-Jews would accept Christianity because they saw it as a form of Judaism. Eventually, it used to be that the Christian Shabbos was Shabbos. That was it. It was actually the way we keep it. They changed it to Sunday because they wanted to show that it wasn't Judaism. And like every good, PR man, he knows that it's much easier to band together when you have someone to go against. And so searching for that person, the easiest figure for him to find were the Jews, because when they began to preach Christianity at the times of the Romans was a great power. So trying to go against the religion of the Romans and the pagan and the idols and the stuff and the mythology that they believed in wouldn't gain traction. But the Jews were always a good target. And so that's why it sort of formed that the Jew became this boogeyman, this evil character to the world. But there hadn't been whole-scale slaughters, and there hadn't been massive attacks by Christians upon the Jews, mainly because there was no real pretext, there was no real reason to, and the Jews weren't really a threat. But interestingly enough, as we're done a little introduction, we're going to come to a point in time now where we'll see how the blood libel became the stepping stone for anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish people for for the next 2,000 years till today. Norwich, England. So in England has this interesting relationship with the Jews, where we have very old communities in England, yet we were expelled from England for a certain time. England was known as the great powers, one of the great powers of Europe at that time. Of course, it became a great power much later. Like we'll remember in our history of the imperial, the kingdom of the British kingdom spreading later. But at that point, they were still one of the more powerful little fiefdoms in Europe. And in Norwich, England, what ended up happening was that there was a young boy named William, and he was found dead in the woods. This was not an uncommon sight. Why? Because there was a civil war brewing in England at that time, and that's nothing new. But there was King Stephen, and there was this Queen Matilda. They were half sisters, and they were a half sister and brother, and they were fighting over who the crown belonged to. And there were killings all over the countryside. So finding a body in the woods in the outskirts of Norwich, England, wasn't exactly news. In other words, okay, fine, they found the body. In fact, most people, in all estimates, it must have been that the body sat there for at least a week or something before it was actually found upon. Because if you reported a body in England at that time, it was a whole. You had to go down to the courthouse, so to speak. You had to give your testimony. You were called on time again. Suddenly, you were a suspect. So people didn't want to report a body. Eventually, a man found upon it, and he was someone who was in the woods. Why was he in the woods? He was in the woods because there were people that were involved in the black market there. They used to chop down wood that wasn't there, so he was searching for them. He found someone, a woodcutter, and the woodcutter, hoping that he can get away from this official, what he did was he said, "Oh, I think you'd be interested. Come here." So he diverted him from his illegal woodcutting business, and he came to this body in the woods. He finds this body in the woods, a young boy. It comes out to be his name is William, and he's from a nice, prestigious family in the town. So they question the mother, and the mother says, someone offered him a job a couple of weeks ago. And I said, okay, fine, it's a job at the archdeacon, whatever. Okay, fine. She claimed to be very uneasy. How do we know she claimed to be very uneasy? Well, history is always written by the victors, and there was a brother Thomas, a monk, who wrote a book, and he claimed to have interviewed her. So this is what he claims. He claims that he interviewed her, and she said, I was very uneasy about this man. And she said, later, I asked my daughter to follow them, and I found my daughter said that she saw them going into the house of a Jew. Okay. So basically, there were no leads. There were no real leads. I mean, you had this, cockamamie story that maybe some Jew was involved in it, and there was nothing going on. The sheriff at that time, so the sheriff was a man who had great political power and was more than just a sheriff, as you think of, in a Western, a guy holding a gun. He was more or less the, sort of the governor of the area. He decided that there was no reason to attack the Jews. The Jews had a nice community there. They had never made any trouble. And he wasn't interested in having claims that someone from the Jewish community murdered him. And so it went, nothing happened. William was buried, and that was that. This happened in between the first and second crusade. So what happens is the story goes dead. That's where all our story ends. In other words, and it would have stayed that way. However, what happened next was a bishop who was a very good lawyer, and he created a monster by using a claim which we know as the blood libel. So what happens is that a couple of years later, 5-6 years later, a rich Jew. Now, my article, I wrote a name, but I'm not sure if that is the name, but I would call him Aaron. A rich Jew named Aaron was a moneylender, and he was found murdered in the forest. And it wasn't too hard to find out who did it. Simply put, because the one who did it, Simon de Nevers, was bragging about it all over. He was claiming very simply that, he had killed this Jew. Why had he killed a Jew? Because he was his moneylender. So we all know about the Jewish moneylender and the stereotype that, oh gosh, Jews lend money and Jews steal money and they lend money. And this is where it came from. Lending money is a very lucrative business. obviously, because you take interest. Now, we know that the Torah says that you can't lend to another Jew with ribbis, with interest. The only one a Jew is allowed to lend to with interest is a non-Jew. Okay. The church had outlawed years previously any Christian from lending to another Christian with interest. So funny enough, only a Jew was able to lend to a non-Jew with interest, and the opposite also happens, that a Christian could lend to the Jews with interest. So the Jews were needed in this field. Now, the Jewish rights and what they were able to do was not so simple in those days. However, money lending was something they were needed for, and so they were allowed. Eventually, what had happened a little bit before our story, the story of Aaron being murdered by Simon, was that Edessa, which was one of the states, one of the Christian states in the East, had fallen to Muslim hands. And the church called for a second crusade. And many of the kings and the knights sort of the lucrative time to make money, a lucrative time to go get rich on spoils of war. And so they got together and said, yes, let's make a second crusade. Let's go to the Holy Land. But military campaigns are very costly. There was armor, food, horses. It was extremely costly. And people needed money. You see, the kings would pay for some infantryman, but if you were a regular knight and you didn't have money to go, and you wanted to make money and you wanted to go and have the glory of going to a military campaign and distinguishing yourself as being a great knight, you had to have money. And how would you come about the money? So there were money lenders, and most of them were Jews. So Simon went to this Jew named Aaron. Now, obviously, Aaron was a controversial figure. If you're lending money to a knight who's going to fight in the second crusade, with the first crusade still fresh in their minds, it's only 50 years about. And during the first crusade, the crusaders had murdered Jewish communities, pillaged and destroyed Jewish communities. Obviously, this wasn't something that was smiled upon by Jewish authorities. It's a very careful balance between you're paying him, if you're allowed to pay someone to maybe, if he goes and kills Jews. Yet he did lend him the money, and Simon took the money. What ended up happening was that the second crusade was an abject failure, right? None of the great actual militaries of that time of any of Europe actually succeeded in anything. The only victory that happened was by the peasants. It was a little contingent of peasants who happened to win some of the Muslims. Otherwise, they were repelled and completely annihilated. So here they are coming back to Europe. And Simon is coming back to his hometown of Norwich, England. And he's a laughingstock. And he's got nothing to his name. He has not a penny left to his name. He has no pride. He has no honor. He's going around. And then there's this man, Aaron, who comes to him and says, hey, you owe me money. So he did what desperate men do. He decided he had to take care of his problem in a different way. And so he killed Aaron. And being a boastful and not a great personality, in fact, even the monk who wrote this history wasn't too happy about the character of Simon. He boasted about it. And so the Jewish community in Norwich went into an uproar. They demanded for justice, and they appealed to the king. Now, there are a lot of things at stake here. On the one hand, you can't go around and start arresting all the people who are involved in the crusade. It's not a good look for the church when the heroes of the crusade are being arrested for murdering a man for money that he owed him. On the other hand, the king had to claim that he was trying to do just by the Jewish community. At this point, the money lending operation had given the Jews power because they were actually, big financiers. And the king was still in the middle of a civil war, and he needed his support. So first, there was a small trial in the town of Norwich, which wasn't really recorded. And the king, seeing the magnitude of the situation, decided we're going to have a real trial in London. And this was a widely attended event. And it came to the event. And first, the prosecution comes up. So in short, the prosecution was the Jewish community of Norwich versus Sir Simon. And it comes up. And they had a case with no holes. They had found the accomplices. They had everything you need to make certain that he was guilty. It was proven beyond a doubt. And it looked like an open and shut case. The defendant was a certain Bishop Cherby, who the lawyer, the bishop, came up with a brilliant scheme. He stood up and he said, yes, Aaron was killed by Simon, and that's for certain. However, he had a right to kill him. And he turned the trial on his head, and he said that there was a death a few years prior, a young boy named William, which was never solved. However, we have reason to believe that the Jewish community of Norwich, he charged the whole community, and he said Aaron, which was a leader of the Jewish community, partook in this, and he's just as guilty as the whole community. He's part of the community. They killed this child, William, and he became very explicit, and he said that they captured the child, and for 9 days they tied him to a cross, and they drew his blood, and they bled him to death. Why did the Jews do that? Why in the world would the Jews do that? He said it was to reenact how our Savior was killed, and he was murdered, and to laugh in the face of Christianity. And that was his claim. Now what he did was brilliant. What the bishop did was turn the court on its head. And after a session, the king decided that because of these charges, we cannot charge Sir Simon with the death of Aaron until we figure out if the Jewish community actually killed William a couple years before. So they sent everybody home, and what ended up happening was absolutely nothing. They never charged Simon again, and they never investigated into William's death. And it sort of stopped. And that was pretty much the story. Norwich, England didn't have any real repercussions from this story. No anti-Semitic pogroms swept the area. It was mostly quiet. But what had been born was the blood libel. It's not in the form we know yet today, but it had been born. The first claims that Christian children were murdered, and this claim was as a reenactment of the killing of Yashka, but the first time that a Jewish community and whole was charged with the murder for ritual, for Jewish ritual murder, that it was part of our culture to kill someone, to kill a Christian child. It would spread in 4 consecutive cases. In France, a couple years later, the king of Paris actually saw this as a chance because the political landscape at that time, he wasn't backing the Jews, and he used this as a pretext. He created a blood libel which wasn't investigated, and these claims were never even brought to trial, but just the claims of blood libel were enough to turn everybody against the Jews, because anyways, people didn't like the Jewish people. Plus, you had this figure of all over Europe. You know, the heroes of the crusade were coming back, and they had to pay debts now. So the Jew became this figure, oh my gosh, he's taking our money, and now they're killing our children. And so it was easy to feed into the growing, hatred of the Jews. And that's how it became. Now, the blood libel will continue on for the next couple hundred years, and it would be used in various cases, and communities were definitely killed, and not to downplay that. But the evolution of the blood libel, the next step of the blood libel would come to be a couple hundred years later. But that's the beginning. So in other words, the blood libel didn't really come to be because there was actual case of something that really happened, or because, people actually were believed that it came into place because it was used. It was a pretext. It was used as a way to distract the population, the growing unrest of the population with the Christians, finding a scapegoat. They needed a scapegoat, and a brilliant scapegoat came into the fact that the Jews would kill the Christians. The next part of our story will take place in Italy. Now, I'm sorry, and we'll go back for 1 second. What happened was that the church also wanted to capitalize on William's death. And what they did is that they claimed that he was a saint. Making a saint out of any person was very lucrative, because what ended up happening is that person's tomb became a site where people visited. It became an attraction to the town, and it would greatly lift that city. So after the allegations, this brother Thomas, who wrote the history on this trial, wrote a book about the Saint William, claiming that this child that was killed was a saint. And eventually Norwich became very, very popular because they had their own saint. Not every town had their saint. And as that happened, more and more communities also wanted to add a saint and added, it was a great PR for your city, come to the city where this and this saint happens. And so you had, in the coming years, all these blood libels would create young Christian children who people were easy to back, pure, innocent, obviously they were saintly, and make a saint of a city and make the city very popular and, bring great claim and PR to the city. Now, a couple hundred years later in Italy, there was a child named Simon who was found murdered. And Simon of Trento. Simon of Trento was a young Christian child who they found in a river. And he was found murdered. And automatically they claimed that the Jews had killed Simon. The unique part of Simon's case was that this happened. This was the first big case of blood libel after the advent of the publishing, the press, the printing press. Now, of course, there were printing presses before this time, and there were printing presses throughout history. In China, the Chinese and the Asians, they've had printing presses for a long time. They used to do it through wood, but the metal plates, the basis of the printing press today, that you can make thousands of millions of volumes of books, and you can produce it cheaply and produce it around, was made by Gutenberg. And Gutenberg's press was made in 1440. So this is a couple hundred years later. We'll continue on our story after the original blood libel in Norwich. Once he made the printing press, what happened is it greatly accelerated civilization. And the reason is because now it wasn't a select few who had books and were able to, read the great histories of the world and the great ideology of the world. Suddenly became widely available. And the Middle Ages sort of ended with the advent of the printing press permanently because now everybody had access to information, everybody had access to wisdom. Another thing it did was it was able to spread propaganda far and wide. So before that, it was word of mouth. The Jews killed this guy. He would pass on to this person. That person would pass on to that person, and it would try to get around. But how far could it get away? Here, suddenly, if a guy on horseback would take a book and he would be delivered to the next town over, the whole town could read about it and produce another copy, and then another person could read about it, and so on and so forth. It became very strong. The saying goes, when a legend becomes fact, then you print a legend. Printing became the ultimate sign that this is actually valid. In other words, that whatever is in this book is a valid claim because it was printed. It must be true. So Simon of Trento had a massive propaganda campaign associated with it. They claimed that the Jews had done it. They made posters and they made depictions, cruel depictions, illustrated the paintings. You can find these paintings still online, and it's the famous paintings of a Jewish boy being held up by countless Jews and them collecting a pail, and underneath the blood was being collected into this pail, into this bucket. And that was how the blood libel spread far and wide. Can you imagine if you were sitting in a different place, you were sitting in France, and suddenly you got a copy of a poster which has a picture of a Jew be murdering a young Christian child with blood, and underneath it a statement saying that they killed a Jewish child, and they did it because they wanted to kill him as a reenactment of the killing of Yashka, and to use the blood. So that this wrinkle about the fact that Jews needed blood for their matzahs was something added on throughout those generations. Somewhere in the 1400s, it came into being. How exactly it came into, I don't know if Italy was the first time it had ever been said, but it definitely wasn't around the beginning. When the blood libel went from England and traveled over into Europe, into the rest of Europe, that's sort of when this creased, when this added claim that we did it for the matzah came involved. But definitely it didn't stop people from claiming blood libel if the child was killed, at a different time of the year. If it wasn't even before Pesach, if it wasn't when they were baking matzahs, people would still claim it was a Jewish child. And they would claim because they're just doing to reenact the murder of Christ, but not. But it definitely did become a central theme because it added to the myth. It was a great. It had a whole different element to it. Not only are they killing our children, but now they're using the blood, which they have of these children, and they're using it in their matzahs. So it spread far and wide, and it led to pogroms in the area of Italy and expulsions and murder and destruction for all the Jewish communities in Veneto, Lombardy, in Tyrol. These were all areas in Italy which were completely decimated after the murder of Simon took place. Again, none of these claims are substantiated. Obviously, there's no such thing. It's not true, but that didn't stop anybody. It was inflamed. Now, what was the church's position? And that's a good question. We're going to get onto this. So definitely the local bishops and the local zealous, church-going people, they definitely were involved in believing these claims. But the question of what the actual position of the Christian church, we're going to get to in a little bit. Now, halachically speaking, when the code of Jewish law was coming into play, the rabbis modified a halacha saying, and you can read this today. We just had the Seder. You preferably in Jewish law you drink red wine, because wine, according to the Torah, is red by nature, and white wine is considered wine, but not as great and not as chashiv, not as honorable as red wine. On the Seder night, you have to have the best wine available, obviously. The rabbis of that time, and until today, it's in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, say that if your town or your city where you're living, there are problems that people are claiming, there's allegations of blood libel, that the people are using blood, you should not use red wine, because people will claim that maybe the wine is really blood, and you should use white wine. But that just comes to show you that the immense effect that blood libels were having on Jewish people. The fact that we changed a massive halacha, simply put, because it was so dangerous. Rabbeinu Tam, years previously, I skipped by this part, but to mention, Rabbeinu Tam sat out and wrote letters to the great governments of the time, trying to please beg that there should not be any, that the government should not believe in these claims of blood libel. It was, simply put, it became the biggest and most prevalent threat to Jewish communities of Europe, was the fact that we were killing young Christian children. And as soon as anybody in any town would claim there was a body, even if there wasn't a body, it automatically incited pogroms. There was nothing to talk about. And the Jews really didn't know what to battle about it. Now, in 1512, the Maharal of Prague was born. The Maharal of Prague was Rabbi Yehuda ben Eliezer Lowy. Maharal of Prague is a very, very famous figure in Jewish history. First of all, he's famous in simply his works are brilliant works. The Gur Aryeh, which is a commentary on Rashi, which obviously Rashi is a commentary on Chumash, on the Bible itself, is probably the most well-known or most well-regarded out of the commentaries in Rashi. The Maharal was an ardent opponent of the method of pilpul, which is a certain way of learning the Gemara, which doesn't take the Gemara very literally, doesn't take the Talmud literally, and wants to extrapolate meaning. And the Maharal was not a fan of this. But besides for his scholarly accomplishments, the Maharal of Prague worked tirelessly throughout his whole life to improve the physical condition of his Jewish brethren. Maharal of Prague became very good friends with, and he became the chief rabbi in Prague, and in Prague, which is in Bohemia, he became very good friends with King Rudolf II, which was the leader at that time of Bohemia. And he worked tirelessly with him to explain to him that these allegations, these libelous claims, which are a lot of libelous claims going on about the Jews, but the biggest one, that we were Jewish ritual murder, which were part of our religion, mandates us to kill Christian children, is not true. And he begged, and he really did convince. In fact, he was able to curtail in his area of Europe, and in general, the aristocracy in Europe started to look upon the blood libel after the Maharal's claims and after Maharal's efforts as a lie. In fact, the church, which had been wishy-washy on its approach to the blood libel, commissioned several internal investigations, and to the credit of the Christian church, they did come out and they said that any claims of blood libel cannot be substantiated. There is no such a thing as a blood libel in Jewish religion. Did it stop the blood libels completely? Absolutely not. Did the church really put an effort out to stop the destruction of Jewish people and their property based on claims of blood libel? No, because the church wasn't one power which everybody answered one to another. It was sort of made up of a bunch of powerful men, and then obviously in the Rome and the Vatican, they were the most powerful. But the church didn't go out of their way, but they never published a finding to all of the churches around Europe that they actually found the blood libel to be false. But they did have an investigation, and it was written actually by one of the people who came a pope, and they actually saw through the efforts of the morale and people like him that it was not true, the blood libel. But they definitely did not go all the way, and they did not stop it. But the morale, on the other hand, did. Now, when we get to morale, we obviously come to the Golem. The Golem of Prague, who is one of the automatically associates when you talk about the morale of Prague, you obviously associate the Golem with him. The legend has it that the morale created a Golem by using practical Kabbalah. So the Kabbalah has, two parts of it: the part that we think about, the part that we learn, we study aspect of the scholarly aspect of the Kabbalah, and then you have practical Kabbalah. So Kabbalah deals with creation, the secrets behind creation. So if you use some of the formulas in the Kabbalah, you can create. Now, you have to be a great Kabbalist to sort of speak, create life or create some sort of form of life with the Kabbalah, and the morale definitely was. Legend has it is that he created a Golem. A Golem is a lump of clay made like a man, without intelligence, but would follow every directive of the morale. Sort of like Frankenstein. Frankenstein is based on a play which was based on the legend of the Golem. And the legend has it that he created a Golem first and foremost to fight the claims of blood libel. He would prowl the streets of the Jewish ghetto, try to find anybody trying to plant a body or the like, and he would bring them to justice. Legend has it the night actually that the morale of Prague was born, which was the night of the Pesach Seder, because they were running to find a midwife or to find a doctor to get to have his wife give birth. They ran into two people that were trying to smuggle a body into the Jewish ghetto, and they were able to arrest them and able to thwart a blood libel. So just from the beginning, the morale was always one whose life mission was to stop his Jewish brethren from being persecuted. And the morale succeeded very much. And as the years went on throughout history, the blood libel sort of calmed down, because the aristocracy in Europe, as we said, the noblemen had begun to not believe the claim, and the peasants there was a very famous case in Metz in the 1600s where people were murdered in Metz, but at the end of the day, it wasn't as it had slowed down. Of course, it didn't end, and in fact, it exhibited a rebirth. And when did that rebirth happen? Was in the 1700s. Now, the 1700s, what happened then is a very famous man came to be. In the mid to late 1600s, there's a man named Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was a false messiah. What does that mean? It means he claimed that he was Mashiach, and he got the entire Jewish world up in a frenzy. And he had a great PR man. He had a great prophet, Nathan of Gaza. And they went around and they claimed that this here, Shabtai Tzvi, he was Mashiach. And he, by all accounts, was a charismatic man, a man who everybody, was eating out of his hand. He had a golden tongue, and he looked righteous, and he looked the part, and he played the part, and people thought that he was Mashiach. That much. People sold their properties and their businesses and their homes, and up they went to him. And as he was on his way to Israel, he comes to Turkey and he gets arrested by the Sultan. And over there, he was thrown into jail and given a choice: either die, either be put to death, or convert to Islam. And he did convert. He converted. And so obviously it became very clear very quickly that he was not Mashiach. This created this dealt a drastic blow to the Jewish community of Europe, and it took years to recover. In fact, the reason today that we have misnagdim, when you hear about Chassidim and misnagdim, you hear about people, the opponent of Chassidim and the beginning of Chassicism and the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe and Shneur Zalman Adi, the people opposing them, the reason is because the Baal Shem Tov came after Shabtai Tzvi, and people were very, very wary of having a new religion, a new sect coming in Yiddishkeit, a new version of Judaism, which would eventually be proven false, just like Shabtai Tzvi, and then it would destroy Jewish morale again. And the rabbis were very hesitant to accept anything because they didn't want it to happen again. They didn't know if the Jewish people could survive a second blow like Shabtai Tzvi, because we've been persecuted throughout the years. But it's one thing if a foreign power subjugates us and puts us through, horrible acts. But, we have a defined streak in us and we band together. It's another thing when there's fissures and there's cracks in our very foundations. When we can't trust another Jew, it causes much great harm. And one of the greatest harms ever caused in Jewish history was Shabtai Tzvi, and the rabbis really didn't want that to happen again. Because even after he died, there was a group of Jews that continued to believe in him. One such family was the family of Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank is another false messiah who came into being. He was born after the whole fiasco of Shabtai Tzvi. But he was, the reason why he's called Frank is because he spent some time in Turkey and then he came back, so he was known as a Frank. In other words, he was known as someone from that part of the world, as a Sephardi. And when he came back to the area, he got a cult following within the Shabtai Tzvi followers. And he soon claimed that he was the reincarnation, or he was the next in line, he was a successor, he was the full Mashiach. What was his ploy? Why did people come and join him specifically? Mostly because he was a very charismatic man, and B, he added a new twist. He added in the fact that sexual promiscuity, sexual transgressions became actually part of his religion. He claimed that was the only way to purify the world was by committing all of those types of sins. And it did attract a great crowd. And he used to do these massive Kabbalistic rituals and involved with very graphic and disturbing ideas of taken from Judaism, taken from Christianity, mixed them together, and put in obviously a lot of promiscuous activity. And he came out his own version of Judaism. What happened over time is eventually Jacob Frank would be arrested in Poland, where most of his followers were. He would eventually lead the biggest conversion to Christianity in one time in Jewish history. All of his followers, about 3,000 to 5,000 people, and he faded into oblivion. I mean, you don't really hear about Jacob Frank in Jewish history. In Polish history, he actually has some sort of following because a lot of great Polish a playwright actually wrote a play about him, and so it sort of has, in Poland they do know about him, but mostly in Jewish history it's negligible. There's nothing that really came out of him. What did come out of him was, at a certain point, the rabbis were fighting tooth and nail against Jacob Frank. Of course, a big player here was Rabbi Mendel, who he was the Yavitz, as he was known, who was a big proponent. He really, fought tooth and nail with the Frankists and with anybody who dared follow Shabtai Tzvi. If anybody's interested in that era, it is a fascinating to look at the fight between Rabbi Mendel and Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz, two sterling characters and two great scholars who fought with another. Rabbi Mendel claiming that Yonasan Eibschitz, or Jonathan Eibschitz, he was actually a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. That's what he claimed, and they would fight back and forth, writing letters against one another. But the rabbis banded together and they decided that enough was enough. They made a cherem. Cherem is complete excommunication. Today, if a court makes excommunicates someone, it's a big deal. But we're much more fractured than we were in Europe at that time. In other words, there are a lot of different forms of Judaism. You have Reform, you have Conservative, you have all Modern Orthodox, Ultra Orthodox, Hasidic, Misnagdim, Litvish, Veltish. You have a bunch of different types. And so if one community disregards you, you can go to the next one. On the other hand, at that time in Europe, if there was a cherem by a religious authority, if there was an excommunication put out that this person we will not have anything to do with, there was no way these people could live among Jews. No Jews would speak to them. No Jews would go into their business. No Jew would allow them in their school. And it became a very big problem because they weren't exactly allowed to live in normal society either. So they had no place. If you were excommunicated, you had no one to turn to. You couldn't turn to the regular people. You couldn't turn to the secular world because Jewish rights were always curtailed, especially at that time in Europe. And you couldn't turn to the Jewish world because the entire Jewish world listened to the Jewish authorities, which were the Rabbanim, which were the rabbis. And if they excommunicated, they didn't involve you. And so it became a vicious war backwards and forth between them, and each one, playing a major part and really inflicting wounds upon the different communities. There were various communities which the Frankists teamed up with the authorities to decimate and to destroy Jewish communities everywhere. And there were various times that the Jewish communities fought back. What happened is that eventually Brody, in the town of Brody, the Jewish council decided they were going to do something that was very frowned upon by most Jews, and they're going to turn to authorities and try to get them to help them on their attacks against the Frankists. Why did they do this? Because they thought it was the only way to help them, and they thought they would be able to get the authorities on their side. Instead, what the authorities did, which was the local bishop, was that he played them. He turned to the Frankists, he turned to Jacob Frank and his followers, and he said, listen, what we can do is that I need you to help me destroy the image of your fellow Jews. And if you do that, I will come on your side, and you will have the full power of the law to persecute the rabbis. And they did. So they published a book with the bishop's help. And the book said that the Jews indeed use blood for their matzah. This was like a guilty admission by the Jews themselves. This was as if the Jews themselves had claimed it. And you tried to explain to someone the difference between, no, this was an author that wasn't actually part of the mainstream Judaism. People didn't care, or people didn't understand that there was a difference in Yiddish in different types of Jews. Instead, the real thing, what they understood was that the Jews admitted to the blood libel right after this book came out, right? It's more of a pamphlet. Right after this pamphlet came out, it spread far and wide, and Jewish communities, especially in Poland, were put to the sword, and the blood libel and the guilty admission of the Frankists were used as a pretext. And that, if you want to know the history of the Frankists, that is their most enduring impact on Jewish history, is the fact that they actually continued and sort of led to and helped rebirth allegations of blood libel. So eventually what happened with the Frankists, like we spoke about, was that they eventually converted to Christianity, and so they fell away from Jewish history. Jacob Frank's daughter did continue leading his cult, but by the third generation they fell into obscurity. Now, over the next 100 years or so, it continued moving around Europe with a little bit of rebirth. In fact, it even entered into the Muslim lands when it came into the Ottoman Empire, and into Rhodes, which was an island that was under the Ottoman Empire, was under the rule of the Muslims. And the reason why in general the blood libel had never reached those grounds is because the claim of Christian children obviously did not pertain and did not have anything to do with the Islam, Muslim children. But at this point, there were a Christian community that in Damascus and in Rome and in Rhodes, had claimed that there was a Christian child murder there, and the Damascus affair, or the Rhodes affair, as it is known, in 1840, was basically dealing back and forth with the claims, and the reason why they were in the beginning supported was because it was politically the different setup over there was very politically not correct, but in other words, the political alignment at that time favored the people that didn't like the Jews and the Jews who were against them. And so eventually, actually, in both of those cases, justice was served, and the Sultan issued an edict proclaiming across the land that the blood libel is not real. So it never really took root in Muslim lands, but there were cases of blood libel, and there were Jews that were killed and jailed and tortured. The Jewish community was put under lockdown for a couple of weeks in those cases. And that was a direct correlation to after the whole fiasco with Jacob Frank. Now we're going to approach the end of the 1800s and getting into the 1900s. We're getting into Russia. So Russia had a fascination with the blood libel. There was various blood libels which had happened in Russia. The Kishinev one was a big one in 1903. There was one earlier, and even in the 1820s. But in fact, the biggest Russian blood libel was the famous case of Mendel Baylis, which, when you ask someone, what was the last case of a blood libel? Well, you'll probably get an answer, Mendel Baylis. Well, we're gonna discuss that it's not true, that it was the last case, but it definitely was a massive case. Because at this time, Jewish communities worldwide had already begun to band together. Even when we discussed a little bit what happened in Rhodes and in Damascus, Jewish communities had sent people to show and to claim that to prove that the blood libel allegations were not true. So what happened is that at the end of the Tsar's reign, he made a couple of very bad blunders, and one of them was for fighting a war with Japan, and that went really bad for the Russians. And then there was a civil war broke loose in Russia. I believe it was in 1905 maybe, and it was eventually put down. But the Tsar started becoming stripped of all his powers, and there's really the State Duma, which is like the Senate or something. It became really the power in Russia, and as the imperialists, as the Tsar's backers slowly were losing their grip upon Russian, the Russian civilization, and eventually, which would lead after they entered World War I, and they would back out early, and eventually in 1917, where the Tsar would be murdered by his own guards, and eventually the Bolsheviks, which we know as the communists, would come into power. The imperialists were at a very big problem. Russia had a declining state, and they needed there was big unrest, and they needed someone to blame. Simply put, they need a scapegoat to divert the attention off of the Tsar and off of his administration. And a perfect case came to be when in 1911, they found a 13-year-old boy named Andrei Yushchenko dead in a cave. Now, the police did their work, and it became very clear that there was a lady named Vera who was basically the head of the local mafia. She had done it. Why? I believe it was because of the case of where one of Andrei's relatives had started up against her, and she wanted to prove a point and show that she was the power in town, so she killed this child, Andrei. But when the Ministry of Justice got wind of this, they saw in it an opportunity to turn this into, to their advantage. So what they did is they claimed that a Jew had killed this child for ritual murder. Now, the world in 1911 was a very different place than in the previous years. Civilization had already begun to turn, right? This is the 20th century already. However, in Russia, they were still behind. And so they claimed that the blood libel, that they had killed Andrei, and the government needed a scapegoat. Now, they didn't really clear who the person was, because they didn't really construct a case that was believable that a Jew had actually killed him. What they really did was they wanted to prove not that Andrei was killed by a Jew, but that Jews performed ritual murder. And if they happened to clear the man who they claimed, couldn't care less. As long as the people of Russia believed that the Jewish nation performed ritual murder as part of their religion. And the scapegoat they picked was a man by the name of Menachem Mendel Baylis, who was a soft-spoken, respected, came from a Hasidic family. He happened to be picked because he lived near where Andrei had gone missing, and one of the only Jews who was allowed there. He ran a brick factory there. And he was only one of the Jews that was allowed in that area because he had special rights, being the superintendent, being the chief of the brick factory, and they dragged him away to jail. If you were interested in this case, you should definitely read his book. He has a memoir, a beautiful memoir, in which he describes what it meant to go in jail. He was in jail for over 2 years while he awaited trial. And what took place in the defense of Menachem Mendel Baylis was startling. All the Jewish communities worldwide banded together very strongly. Now, what the Russian government had decided to do was that they decided the best approach was to try to do what the bishop had done with the local bishop in Poland had done with the Frankists. He turned to the Misnagdim, which the chief rabbi at that time of Kiev, where this had taken place, was a Misnag. In other words, he wasn't a follower of Hasidus. And he said to him, you know what? Here, what we'll do. We'll exonerate the rest of the Jews, and we'll say that there's an extreme sect called Hasidim who they use blood. You go along with this, and the rest of the Jews will be exonerated. And it was a good chance. In other words, here it was a good ploy, because the reason why they chose the Hasidim to attack was, one, because they looked more zealous and they were more easily believable. They were less integrated into Russian society, and so people were able to use them better as a scapegoat. Two, they were considered revolutionaries because they really stood in the face of the Russian Empire, and they didn't back down. In various cases, and most recently, but the case of the Jewish children being conscripted to the army, the people that went on self-sacrifice to try to save Jewish boys were the Chassidim, and so they figured that the most dangerous out of the Jews were the revolutionaries, would be the Chassidim. And they felt that if they take out the Jews, they would sort of handle the Jewish question. If take out the Chassidim, they would handle the Jewish question in Russia. To the credit of the rabbis involved, they absolutely said, no, we will not do such a thing. We will not take this and make this into a Chassidim and Mesnagdim, that some Jews and no Jews do it. We're not doing that at all. We are saying that there is no such thing as the blood libel, because they recognized that the Jewish nation was on trial. It became a massive trial. Everyone was sent. In fact, the New York Times has various articles on it. They sent a representative from everywhere, all the civilized countries, sent members of the press there. And even there was various support for Beilis amongst the actual imperialist journalists. There were journalists that were right-wing journalists, and they actually had meetings with the rabbis, and they were convinced of Beilis's, actual innocence, and they decided that they're going to actually back justice. So you had on both sides, you had Russians that were backing the just and showing how this case was a farce, and on the other side, you had the imperial government with the party, the ultra-nationalistic party known as the Black Hundreds, which is an openly anti-Semitic party, and they were the ones that were continuing that were claiming that Beilis was actually guilty. In relation to Chabad, they actually claim by this that Mendel Beilis was a follower of Chabad because he knew a man who had eaten dinner by him a few times named Feivel Schneerson. Feivel Schneerson was connected and was of Chabad origin and had the same last name as the rabbis of Chabad. And they claim that in fact it was all of this stemmed from the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, that Tzemach Tzedek, he had actually issued years before that all blood should be sent from the residence of his Chassidim, of his followers. They should send blood to him in Lubavitch, in the origin of the city of the town of Lubavitch, the origin of Chabad. And so it was specifically designed against them. It is interesting to know that I read recently that the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was the leader of Chabad at that time, was debating going to the trial. But because of the open attacks on Chabad, he did not go, and it might have been, and you can look at it a couple of ways, but it might have been because he feared itself that they might arrest him if he were to come there. That's how strongly this was not only an attack against Judaism, and not only against Chassidim, but it was attacking specifically upon the family of the Rebbeim, the Chabad Rebbeim, the Schneerson family. In fact, he sent letters by the king proclaiming the Schneerson family should be a privileged family, all the way back from the first Chabad Rebbe, from Reb Shneor Zamiali, which they read at the trial. Which they didn't read at the trial, but which they received as part of the file. What ended up happening was that after they had tried to prove that he was guilty, it was very hard for them to prove he was guilty. In fact, most of the time they spent claiming that Vera, this lady, they tried to prove that she was innocent. And so the case against Mendel Beilis on the grounds of him being the murderer fell apart very quickly. But the main trial sat down it became a battle of if there's such a thing as Jewish ritual murder. And they claimed they had experts, and they brought a Jew who had converted and a priest who they claimed they knew about Jewish law. And the defense fell to a certain Rabbi Yaakov Mazda, who was the chief rabbi of Moscow. And he actually prepared for it with Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. The night before, it says he prepared deeply. He prepared his defense with him. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson was the chief rabbi of Yaakov Chernoslav and was the father of the Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the current Lubavitchi, the current Rebbe. he replied with a resounding defense. He spoke, it's transcribed that he spoke for 8 hours straight, and he spoke clearly and expressed and showed how it is impossible, according to Jewish law, that ritual murder should exist. And everybody present understood what was going on here. Everybody understood that beyond a doubt, Mendel was innocent. So were the Jews. The question was, there were 12 jurors, and 7 of whom were actually part of the party known as the Black Hundreds, like we discussed a little bit, which was an openly anti-Semitic party. The rest of them were peasants. These were simple people. Could they get past the prejudices of anti-Semitism and inbred anti-Semitism that Jews were bad? That's A. And also, could they dare stand up to the great, mighty Russian Empire? That's what they were doing, because the Tsar was clearly, the Ministry of Justice was trying to found him guilty. And could they actually, pursue justice and say what was real and right? Could they acquit Menachem Mendel Beilis? The answer was that he did, and it's miraculous. And I read Beilis's account, when he heard him say that he was actually not guilty, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it on the grounds, and he said, and before he died, he asked him what was the most amazing part of the whole case to him, and he said, and in his account, he says that the fact that these 12 people were able to do it is something beyond his wildest imagination, and it really is a testament to these people. However, when you look closer at the actual verdict, it clears Beilis of any wrongdoing. But when they say about the general, if there exists Jewish ritual murder, it doesn't exactly clear up the Jews. It's very ambiguous and doesn't answer in clear terms. So although people think this put to rest for the whole world, the idea of a blood libel, it really didn't, because it said that Beilis didn't do it, but perhaps it does exist Jewish ritual murder. And that was the case. And then Mendel Beilis eventually immigrated to Israel, where then eventually after that he moved to America, and he died in New York in 1934. In fact, he became one of the more famous Jewish people, and he was on plenty of plays, and in Broadway, and the Yiddish theater was filled with Mendel Beilis, and it's a fascinating chapter, and there's wonderful books on it. Of course, we know that the Germans, a couple years later in World War II, part of the propaganda that Adolf Hitler would use against the Jews was the blood libel. He would use it time and time again. That is something you can find in Nazi propaganda. But to move on to America, in 1928, so we're discussing less than 100 years ago in America, in Massena, New York, which is a city in upstate New York, there was a girl named Barbara Griffith who went missing. And they searched for her, they couldn't find her, and suddenly the rabbi of the town was called in. His name was a man by Beryl Brennglass, and he was called in, and he was asked by the chief of police if there is any validation, if validity to the claims that maybe one of his Jewish constituents of the community had taken Barbara and murdered her for Jewish ritual murder. So this is happening in New York. Of course, he was horrified, and eventually Barbara was found a couple hours later wandering in the woods, okay and fine. And of course, this prompted that the Jewish community in America banded together, and they received an apology. But first of all, it dawns on everybody that yes, the blood libel can come to America, come to Western civilization, and they weren't impervious to the claims that had happened in Europe. And more importantly, we realized that what had happened if Barbara Griffith had not been found. And although it never went that far in America, the blood libel, it just comes to show how far the blood libel can continue, and how it's never really, and how this crazy claim is continuing to haunt us. Continuing on with the years, in 2005, so we're talking about 15 years ago, the Russian State Duma had members of the Duma, so it's like a senator or a member of parliament coming up and claimed that there were Jewish organizations that still were involved with the blood libel, still involved in Jewish ritual murder, and they asked the prosecutor general of Russia to ban these Jewish organizations. Of course, it ended up being that they never gave any credence to these claims, but this was in 2005. Then in 2007, a very bad development occurred, in which there was an Israeli professor named Ariel Toaf, who published a book, and the book was called Passovers of Blood, the Jews of Europe and Ritual Murder. And in it, he claimed that it might be possible that Ashkenazi Jews, like in the case of Taranto, Italy, which we discussed in the 1400s, might have used small quantities of blood in their matzah. And within a week, he was forced to redact and to take the book out of circulation. However, this book became the biggest guilty admission since the Frankist claims that the Jews had used this. And now anybody who these days, any anti-Semitic group or the like that claims that they have that the blood libel is real, they will all point to this Israeli professor, a Jew himself, claiming that the blood libel might have been true. And it is a very unfortunate event. Again, this in 2007. In 2013, to highlight one of the many times that the Arab world has claimed we have blood libels, there was an organization called Miftah, which is an organization for Palestinians. They claim to be a non-for-profit organization. They claimed that they wrote an open article asking President Obama if he knew what was in the matzah that he ate when he sat by the Seder in the White House. Eventually, they also had to redact, but this is, and then Syria at that time published a TV series with a full season dedicated of TV series about the Zionist threat, and a full season of it dedicated on the fact that in Europe, the Jews had murdered people. This is in 2014. The most recent, obviously, is in 2019, the Poway synagogue shooter. His name obliterated. In his manifest outside of San Diego, when he killed people in the Chabad house outside of San Diego, in his manifest that was found online, they found that one of the reasons he claimed was because of all the saints that the Christian children had killed by the Jews. The event in Poway happened in 2019, about a year ago. So the blood libel, as we sum up the history, the blood libel has stuck with us and claimed from generation to generation. And it's a bloody history, and it's one that's not a pretty one. But what is amazing is you see here the power of Jewish perseverance. You see here the power of no matter who was after us, no matter how many people came to claim that it was, that we were the ones that were killing Christian children. We thousands upon thousands of people gave up their lives and martyrs for the cause for Yiddishkeit. And you can turn the story on its head by seeing the incredible strength that we have. The incredible strength of somehow us persevering. And they liken it to like a chain, how one Jew was able to form a link to one generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. And although there have been so many attempts, we have persevered through all of it. And you can see the incredible strength of what it is to be a Yid. And in today's day and age, even today's day and age. And so when we come up against stuff like COVID and stuff like that, we should know that we've been through it all. And we should have in the memory of all the Kadeshim who lost their lives in battle of horrible allegations, and to stand up for what we believe in, and to keep safe. Have a kosher and a freilich and Pesach.
Shkoyach. I don't know if you can hear me or not, but I enjoyed very, very much. Thank you. If you heard me, cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Mendel was an amazing share.
A good moed. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Alex really said